She had nothing left. No name anyone remembered, no door left to knock on, just the rain, the alley, and three men who'd already decided what happened next. Then he stepped out of the dark, not to save her. Men like Kang Tae-hyun didn't save people. They eliminated problems. But something in her eyes stopped him cold. Something that looked exactly like what he'd buried the night he lost everything too. What happened in that alley didn't just change two lives. It started a war. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take everything you've got. The rain came down hard enough to hurt. It hammered the pavement in sheets, turning the gutters of West 32nd Street into shallow rivers that swallowed cigarette butts and takeout containers and whatever else the night had discarded. The restaurants had shut their lights an hour ago. The karaoke bars still pulsed with color behind frosted glass, neon bleeding pink and gold into the wet street. But out here in the alley that ran behind the row of Korean barbecue joints and herbal medicine shops, there was no color. Just gray concrete, black shadow, and the particular stench of a city that never quite cleaned itself no matter how hard it rained. Kang Tae-hyun stood at the mouth of the alley with his hands in the pockets of a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent and watched three men do something they were going to regret. He hadn't planned to be here. He'd been heading back to the car after a meeting 3 blocks north. A quiet conversation in a private dining room above a restaurant that officially didn't exist, with men who officially didn't know each other. Business. The kind that didn't appear in any ledger or get discussed in any language that a wiretap could make useful. He was supposed to walk to the car, get in, and be back at the estate by midnight. Instead, he'd heard something. Not a scream he might have ignored. The night had its share of those, and most of them resolved themselves without his involvement. What he heard was the particular sound of someone trying not to scream. That tight, controlled stillness of a person who understood that making noise would only make things worse. He knew that sound the way you knew the sound of your own heartbeat. From the inside. He turned into the alley without thinking about it. That was the first sign that the night was going sideways. The three men had her pushed against the wall beneath a broken fire escape, the metal overhead dripping water down in a thin, steady stream that soaked the collar of her jacket. She was young, late 20s, maybe. Black woman, natural hair plastered flat by the rain, jaw set in the particular way of someone who had decided that whatever happened next, they were not going to beg. Her hands were up at chest level, palms open, the universal gesture of someone stalling. Buying seconds. Trying to find the angle. 2 of the men were in front of her. Third was to her left, cutting off the exit. All 3 were big, the muscle-built fast kind that came from correctional facilities rather than gymnasiums. They weren't speaking English. Tae-hyun caught fragments. Mandarin, not the mainland standard, but something coastal, clipped and fast. And he caught enough of the vocabulary to understand what they were discussing. They were debating which vehicle. They were debating timing. This was not a robbery. The man closest to the woman reached for her arm. Tae-hyun said in Mandarin, "Don't." All 3 turned. He was still standing at the alley entrance, hands still in his pockets, rain coming off the brim of his hat in a thin curtain. He looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like a businessman who had taken a wrong turn. He was lean, not visibly imposing, somewhere north of 40, with a face that had gone quiet and still in the way that certain faces did when they had spent too long around violence and learned to stop performing reactions to it. The closest man laughed, said something to the others. The gist, who was this old man in the nice coat? "Walk away," the man said, switching to English now, showing Tae-hyun the particular courtesy of letting him understand his own dismissal. "Not your business." Tae-hyun looked past him at the woman. Their eyes connected for a fraction of a second. Hers were dark, exhausted, and contained behind them a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that had spent years reading situations fast enough to survive them. She was reading him right now, trying to decide if he was rescue or complication. He looked back at the man. "You're working for Shen Guowei," Tae-hyun said. Not a question. He recognized the tattoo on the forearm. "Guowei and I have an arrangement. This block is not part of his territory." The man's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. A flicker of recalculation. He knew the name Kang Tae-hyun. Most people in this business did. The question was whether he believed this was actually him. "You got ID?" the man said, which was almost funny. "I have something better," Tae-hyun said. "I have a phone, and Guo answers when I call." A beat. The three men exchanged a look. That was the problem with freelance enforcement. The chain of command had gaps in it, and the gaps were exactly where moments like this lived. The one on the left moved first. He always did, in these situations. The one on the left was always the fastest and the least patient, which was also why the one on the left rarely lasted long. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not complicated. It was simply efficient, and it was ugly in the way that real violence was ugly. Not choreographed, not cinematic, full of sounds that had no place in any edited version of events. Tae-hyun moved out of his pockets and into the space between them, and he used the rain and the dark and the fact that none of them had expected actual resistance. And when it was done, all three men were on the wet pavement, and Tae-hyun was breathing harder than he would have liked, and there was blood on his knuckles that was not entirely his own. He stood still for a moment, assessed. All three breathing. That was fine. He preferred it that way when the situation allowed. Bodies created paperwork, and paperwork had a way of becoming complications. He turned around. The woman hadn't run. He hadn't expected that. Most people ran. The situation had its own gravity. Violence occurred. The threat collapsed. The door opened. Survival instinct pushed through it. But she was still standing against the wall with her back straight and her chin up and her eyes on him. And there was something in her posture that was not quite composure but was trying very hard to be. "You should go," he said. "Where?" she said. The word hit the air between them and stayed there. Not rhetorical, genuine. She wasn't asking for directions. She was asking a real question. And Tae-hyun, who had not survived 43 years and the specific industry he inhabited by making impulsive decisions, found himself standing in the rain staring at a stranger and not having an answer that felt sufficient. He took off his coat. He wasn't sure why. The movement was almost involuntary. His hands moved to the buttons before his mind formally issued the instruction. The way your hand pulled back from a hot surface before conscious thought registered the burn. He held it out to her. She stared at it for a second. Then she took it. She pulled it around her shoulders and something went out of her face. Not relief exactly, more like the particular deflation of a person who had been braced against something for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like not to be bracing. She pulled the coat tighter and she looked away, and he saw her throat move. "I don't have anybody," she said. The voice was quiet, almost conversational, like she was reporting a fact rather than confessing to it. There's nobody I can call. There's no place I can go right now that those men can't follow me to." She stopped, swallowed again. "I know that sounds like a problem you didn't sign up for." "No," he said. She looked at him. "It is a problem I did not sign up for," he said. "But that is not the same as one I will ignore." He pulled out his phone, made a call. Spoke in Korean for 30 seconds. Clipped, directive, the kind of language that expected compliance rather than questioning it. He ended the call and looked at her again. "A car is coming. You will come with me." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "That's supposed to be a reason not to get in a stranger's car." Under ordinary circumstances, yes. He looked down at the three men on the ground, the rain soaking through their jackets, the water running thin pink where his knuckles had connected. These are not ordinary circumstances. She looked at the men, looked at him. The calculus of desperation was something he understood. It was not comfortable math, but it was math people performed when the options had narrowed to a specific and limited set. "What's your name?" she asked. He told her. He watched her face for recognition. Most people had a reaction, something in the eyes, the jaw, a tightening around the mouth that meant the name had landed somewhere, it meant something. She had no reaction, which meant either she genuinely didn't know it or she was very, very good at not showing things. He suspected both were partially true. "Zuri," she said. "Zuri Bennett." The car arrived at the alley entrance. Black, sleek, windows that told you nothing about what was inside. The rear door opened from within. Zuri Bennett looked at the car, looked at the alley, looked at Tae-hyun, made the choice that people made when they were out of choices, which was still a choice, just made with different math than the ones that came before it. She walked toward the car. The estate was 40 minutes north of the city, past the point where the highway exits began to space further apart, and the lights along the road grew sparse, and the sky actually showed stars through the breaks in the cloud cover. The property was behind a gate, and behind the gate was a long drive lined with old trees. And at the end of the drive was a house that was too large and too quiet, and lit in the particular way of places where security was not decorative. Zuri said nothing for most of the drive. Taehyun respected that. He sat across from her in the back of the car and looked at his phone and made 2 more calls. Terse, Korean, the kind of operational instructions that moved people and information without explanation. The man in the passenger seat up front, who Zuri would later learn was named Jin, did not turn around once during the drive. He sat like a piece of furniture that happened to carry a weapon. Taehyun's coat was still around her shoulders. She hadn't taken it off. He noticed that. Inside the estate, a woman named Mrs. Cho, 50s, iron-haired, with the bearing of someone who had been running large households long enough that she had ceased to find anything genuinely surprising, met them in the entrance hall and took Zuri in with a single comprehensive glance and produced, seemingly from nowhere, dry clothes, towels, and a tray of something hot. "She'll need a room," Taehyun said. Mrs. Cho had apparently already arranged this. She led Zuri toward the east wing stairs. Zuri stopped at the base of the staircase and turned back. Taehyun was still in the entrance hall, jacket off now, loosening his tie. There was a bruise forming along the left side of his jaw that he either hadn't noticed or wasn't concerned about, probably the latter. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He looked at her. It was a direct question and it deserved one. He could have given her the answer that was easiest. Obligation, pragmatism, a code that covered civilians caught in crossfire. All of those were partially true. "Because you asked where you could go," he said, "and I didn't have an answer that I was willing to give standing in the rain." She held his gaze for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being examined by someone who was substantially sharper than the situation she'd been found in suggested. Then she turned and followed Mrs. Cho up the stairs, and Taehyun was alone in the entrance hall, with the rain still hammering the windows and the low hum of the security system and whatever it was that had just begun. He didn't sleep well. He rarely did. There was a period, years ago, before the war for the Eastern Corridor, before his wife's accident, before the weight of what the organization had become settled into his bones like weather, when sleep had been a simple and reliable thing. Now it was a negotiation. He managed 4 hours on a good night and woke up at angles from whatever dream had been working on him. Tonight he sat in his study until almost 3 in the morning, working through the stack of things that required his attention. Satellite reports on 3 distribution networks. A dispute between 2 lieutenants in the New Jersey operation that had metastasized from personal to professional in a way that would require surgical resolution. A communication from Shen Guowei's people sent before tonight's incident that he now viewed in a different light. Guowei's reach into Koreatown had been expanding for 6 months. Tonight's men might not have been freelance after all. He made a note, sent an encrypted message to 2 people who dealt in the currency of information, sat back in the chair and looked at the window where the rain was thinning out, the clouds pulling apart at the seams to show a fragment of dark sky. In the morning he would need to know who Zuri Bennett was, not as a threat assessment, or not only. He would need to know who she was because he had brought her inside his walls, and inside his walls there were 2 children who did not need any more disruption than their lives had already accumulated, and there was an organization that watched everything their boss did and drew conclusions from it. And there was a specific category of enemy who would interpret any connection between Kang Tae-hyun and a woman he did not know as an exploitable vulnerability. He already knew, with the specific certainty of experience, that tonight had not resolved cleanly. Tonight had opened something. He just didn't know yet what kind. She was up before 6. Zuri had not slept, or had slept in the shallow, defensive way that she'd learned in the years since there had been no safe place to sleep deeply. Eyes open at every sound, body cataloging exits, brain maintaining enough consciousness to respond if the situation changed. The room they'd given her was large and clean and contained more furniture than she owned, and a window that looked out over a garden that was, even in the November dark, clearly maintained with an exacting standard of care. She sat on the edge of the bed in the borrowed clothes, soft, clean, somebody's guest room provision, and thought about the last 48 hours, which was the productive kind of thinking she did when panic wanted to come in and she refused to let it. 48 hours ago, she had been in her apartment in Crown Heights, which was an apartment that her landlord was in the process of reclaiming because the building had been sold to a development company, and the development company had a use for the space that did not include its current tenants. 48 hours ago, she had gotten the certified letter confirming what she'd been told was coming and had sat on the floor of the kitchen because there was no chair. She'd sold the furniture 3 weeks ago to cover 2 months of back rent she'd already lost, and had understood that the tether she'd been holding onto had finally run out of slack. She'd gone to Koreatown because she knew someone there, or she'd thought she had. A woman named Renee, who'd been a colleague, sort of, at the nonprofit organization Zuri had been working for before it had run out of funding and shut its doors in August. Renee, who had said she knew of a room available and a possible job lead, and had stopped returning calls 2 weeks ago. Zuri had gone anyway because she was out of other directions to move in. She had found, instead of Renee, 3 men in an alley, and she had found Kang Tae-hyun. She turned the name over in her mind. The absence of reaction the night before had been genuine, in the sense that she didn't know the name specifically. But she wasn't naive. She'd ridden in the car. She'd seen the estate. She'd watched Mrs. Cho manage the arrival of an unexpected guest at 11:30 at night, with the practiced calm of someone for whom unusual circumstances were entirely routine. She'd seen Jin, who sat in the front seat, like a piece of armed furniture. She had seen the way the gate staff had moved when Tae-hyun's car arrived. Fast, deferential, organized. She knew what kind of world this was. She simply didn't know the specific name the world operated under around here. The question was what she did with that. She heard it at 6:12. Small feet on hardwood, the particular pattering rhythm of a child moving with determined speed. The sound stopped outside her door. A pause. Then a small, considered knock. She opened the door. 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy was older, 8, maybe 9, with his father's jaw and careful eyes, dressed already in what looked like school clothes, standing with the posture of someone who had been informed that posture mattered. The girl was younger, 6 at most, and was holding a stuffed animal that had once been a rabbit and was now primarily a collection of textile memories of a rabbit, its ears worn thin from years of handling. The boy said, in English that carried the particular precision of someone who had learned it as a third language after Korean and probably Mandarin, Mrs. Cho said there was a guest. There is, Zuri said. That's me, the girl said around the ear of the rabbit. Are you staying? Zuri looked at the girl, at the worn rabbit, at the boy with his careful posture and his father's eyes. I don't know yet, she said honestly. The boy considered this. Sua wanted to know, he said, with the gravity of someone translating a diplomatic message. She usually wants people to stay. Do you? Zuri asked him. He thought about it. It depends, he said, which was a remarkably adult answer from a 9-year-old, and something about it landed in Zuri's chest in a way she didn't fully examine. I'm Zuri, she said. Hanjun, the boy said. She is Sua. Our father's name you probably already know. I know it, she said. He nodded, apparently satisfied with this confirmation. Then, breakfast is at 7. Mrs. Cho makes eggs on Thursdays, if you want to come. He delivered this with the tone of someone extending an invitation that they were personally neutral about, but were extending on behalf of a party who was not neutral. He glanced down at his sister. We should go get ready, he said to her, with the careful authority of a child who had been managing another child for longer than should have been necessary. They went. Zuri stood in the doorway and watched them go down the hall, and something pulled hard beneath her sternum, the specific ache of something that wanted to be named and that she was not ready to name. Tae-hyun was in the kitchen when she came down, not at the table. He was standing at the counter with a coffee cup and his phone, moving between the two with the multitasking efficiency of someone who had been running parallel tracks since long before 7 in the morning. He was in different clothes, but the bruise on his jaw was more visible in daylight. Nobody in the kitchen seemed to think this was remarkable. He saw her, set the phone down on the counter. Did you sleep? He asked. Some, she said, which was a diplomatic fraction of the truth. He looked at her with the quality of attention that she'd noticed the night before. Not aggressive, not intrusive, just precise. Like he was filing information rather than performing interest. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something." She sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Cho materialized with eggs and rice and a small bowl of kimchi and something that Zuri didn't recognize but that smelled like it had been cooking since before anyone else was awake. Hanjun and Sua were already at the table. Hanjun eating methodically, Sua rearranging her eggs in a way that suggested eating was a secondary consideration. Taehyun came to the table and sat. Not at the head of it. He sat at the side, the way someone sat when they were joining a group rather than presiding over it. Zuri noticed that too. "I need to ask you some questions," he said. "If you're willing." "I figured," she said. "Last night, those men, you know what they were doing." "Yes." "Do you know why they targeted you specifically, or was it opportunity?" She picked up her chopsticks, set them back down. "I don't know. I've been dealing with some housing instability. I've been in a few different places the last couple months. There's a shelter I stayed at for a while in September. A friend's couch. The Crown Heights apartment." She paused. "Maybe I was visible. Maybe I was just in the wrong alley." He listened to this with the focused stillness of someone sorting signal from noise. The men were from a trafficking operation that works out of several points along the eastern seaboard. They don't typically work this far west in Manhattan. "You know them." "I know who employs them. It doesn't necessarily connect to you specifically." A pause. "But I need to know if there are other things in your life that might." She looked at him across the table. Sua was watching them both with the uncomplicated openness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't listening. "You want to know if I'm a liability," Zuri said. He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "I want to know who you are," he said, "so that I understand what I've brought inside my house." It wasn't cruel, it was honest, and she'd had enough of the other kind to appreciate the difference. She thought about what to tell him, and she told him the truth, which she hadn't done in a single unfiltered sitting in a very long time. She told him about the nonprofit, a women's resource center in Flatbush, 8 years of casework, grant-dependent, gone in August when the funding dried up, and the board voted to dissolve rather than restructure. She told him about the chain of events that had followed. The apartment she'd been sharing with a colleague who had moved back to her family in Georgia, the Crown Heights place she'd gotten on her own and then couldn't sustain, the months of grinding attrition that had brought her to a place where going to Koreatown on a cold Tuesday night on the strength of a lead she hadn't actually confirmed was the best option available. She told him about her parents. Her mother had died when she was 14. A wrong diagnosis, a medication interaction, 3 weeks in the hospital, and then not anymore. Her father had made it until she was 21 before his heart gave without warning, and then she had been, in the practical sense, on her own. She'd had an aunt for a while, an uncle by marriage, cousins she'd fallen out of regular contact with, and then a succession of smaller losses, the kind that didn't constitute emergencies but accumulated into a particular shape. And she had looked around one day in her mid-20s and understood that the shape was alone. She'd built things since then, colleagues who mattered, a few genuine friendships. The work at the nonprofit, which had been more than a job, had been, in the plainest sense, the structure around which she'd arranged her life. And then the work had gone, and the structure had gone with it, and the friendships had their own complicated geographies, and she'd been paring down for 6 months until there was very little left to pare. She said at the end of it, "I don't have anybody." And then, almost immediately, "I know how that sounds." Across the table, Hanjun had stopped eating. He was looking at his plate with the exaggerated focus of a child who was pretending not to listen so that the adults would keep talking. Taehyun said nothing for a moment, then, "It sounds like the truth." "It is the truth." She looked at him. "Is it a problem?" He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "No," he said. "It's not a problem." After breakfast, Sua pressed the worn rabbit into Zuri's hands without explanation and toddled off after her brother, and Zuri sat at the kitchen table holding a stuffed animal that had been loved almost past the point of recognition, and she thought about the word family and what it cost to say it and what it cost not to. By noon, Taehyun had made 6 calls, received 12, and held 2 in-person meetings in his study that lasted a combined 40 minutes and covered, among other things, the question of who exactly had sent those men into Koreatown the previous night. The answer, when it came back from his information sources, was more complicated than a random crew working a target of opportunity. The men had been sent. The target had not been Zuri Bennett. The target had been the block. A sweep operation, indiscriminate, the kind of work that Shen Guo ran when he wanted to expand a territory's revenue base without the operational overhead of individual acquisitions. Zuri had been in the wrong alley at the wrong time, which was, in some ways, better news, in some ways worse, because the problem now was not that someone had specifically targeted a woman Tae-hyun had brought into his home. The problem was that Shen Guo was running operations inside Koreatown, which was the heart of Tae-hyun's legitimate business interests and the buffer zone around his actual interests, and doing it with a boldness that suggested he no longer felt the constraints that had previously applied. That meant either Guo had information that had made him confident, or he had muscle that had made him confident, or both. Tae-hyun sat with this for a moment. Then he called the man who handled his intelligence operation and said, "Find out what Guo knows about me that he shouldn't." He spent the afternoon at his desk, and then at 4:30, he heard something he didn't hear often in this house. Laughter. He walked to the window. Below, in the back garden, bare-limbed trees, the last of the autumn roses gone to hip, the November light already thinning at the edges. Suah was running in circles around Zuri, who was attempting to demonstrate something that Suah was attempting to replicate and failing at, which was apparently the entire point, because Suah's failure produced a shriek of delight that carried all the way up to the second floor. Han Jun was sitting on the garden bench with his homework, not participating, but not inside either. He was watching, in the careful way he watched everything, and once or twice Tae-hyun saw the corner of his mouth move in the specific direction of something that was trying to decide if it was allowed to be a smile. He stood at the window for longer than was necessary. That evening, she came to find him. He was in the garden himself by then, the children back inside for dinner and homework, and the routine that Mrs. Cho maintained with the steadiness of continental drift. He was standing near the dormant rose bed with a glass of water, doing what passed for decompression at the end of his kind of day. Zuri came out in a coat that Mrs. Cho had apparently produced from somewhere. The estate had closets that predated specific occupants, and stopped a few feet away. "I want to know what I walked into," she said. "The real version." He looked at her. The light in the garden was gray and thin and honest. "What do you already know?" "I know you're not a businessman," she said. "I know this house has more security than a bank. I know you made a phone call this morning that resulted in information about last night's men by 2 this afternoon, which is not something a businessman can do." She paused. "I know the Korean community in this neighborhood maintains a very specific kind of quiet about your name. And you want to know what that name actually means?" "I want to know what I'm inside," she said, "so I can decide what I'm going to do." He appreciated that. She wasn't asking him to justify it or explain it in terms that made it comfortable. She was asking for the facts so she could assess the facts and make a decision like an adult who had been doing that without assistance for most of her life. He told her, not everything, not the parts that had no relevance to her immediate situation, but enough. The organization, the legitimate businesses that were both real and functional and also structural covers for the other work. The territory, the current state of the Eastern Corridor, which was more contested than it had been in a decade. Shen Guo's name and what it represented. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. "Those children," she said, "they don't have a mother." "She died," he said. 3 years ago. A car accident. On a road I should have insisted she not drive on." The should have was not something he said lightly or often. Zuri seemed to understand that it wasn't light. "They've been growing up in this," she said. "Yes." A pause. "It is not the life I planned for them." "But it's the one they have." "Yes." She looked at him. "Why did you tell me all of this?" "Because you asked a direct question," he said, "and you deserved a direct answer. Most people in your position don't feel that way." "Most people in my position," he said, "have made their peace with it. I have not always." He looked at his water glass. "I don't explain that often either." She nodded slowly. The garden was getting dark. Somewhere inside the house, Su-ah was making a noise that was probably related to the bath time negotiation Mrs. Cho conducted every evening with the patience of a veteran diplomat. "I'll stay," Zuri said. "For now, until I figure out where I'm going." "There's no timeline," he said. "There should be," she said with a precision that he recognized, the voice of someone who had learned the hard way what happened when you got comfortable in a borrowed space. "I don't want to be a charity case." "You are not a charity case." "Then what am I?" He thought about the question, not the tactical version, the real one. What was she? What had she become in 18 hours of existing inside the strange specific gravity of his life? "A person," he said, "who is in a difficult moment, who I chose to offer a different option." He met her eyes. "And who I think is capable of deciding what to do with it." She held his gaze. Then she pulled the borrowed coat tighter and looked back at the house, where the lights were coming on in the upstairs windows, where his children were making the ordinary sounds of evening, where the machine of this complicated life kept running regardless of what either of them decided. "Okay," she said. Just that. "Okay." Taehyun was still in the garden 20 minutes after she went inside. The night had come down fully now, cold and clear following the rain, and he stood in it and worked through what he knew and what he didn't know and what he felt, which was the category he was least accustomed to auditing. His phone rang. Jin's name on the screen. He answered. Jin said, in Korean, clipped and fast, "We have a problem. Guowei's people have been asking questions about last night, about who intervened. They know it was me. They know someone with muscle intervened. They don't have the name confirmed. Yet. How long before they do?" A pause. "Less than 48 hours. Probably less." Taehyun looked at the house, at the lit windows, at the shape of a life that had just 8 hours ago expanded in a direction he had not planned. "Tell Park to move the eastern perimeter schedule forward," he said, "and I need the Guowei intelligence file on my desk by 6 tomorrow morning." He ended the call, stood in the dark for another moment. The problem had never been that bringing Zuri Bennett into his home would have consequences. He had known that from the moment he turned into the alley. The problem was that the consequences were already moving faster than he'd expected. Guowei was asking questions. Guowei was connecting dots. And the dot that connected most cleanly to Kang Taehyun's greatest vulnerability, the one that every enemy in the history of his operation had tried to find and use, was not the organization, not the money, not the territory. It was the children. And now, perhaps, it was something else too. He went inside. The house was warm and too quiet in the way that houses got after children were put to bed. That specific peace that felt fragile at the edges. He climbed the stairs, past the door behind which Su-ah was presumably asleep with her worn rabbit, past Han Jun's door, where a sliver of light told him his son was still reading, the way his son always read too late, the way Taehyun had read too late at his age. He stopped outside his own bedroom door and stood in the hallway and thought about what Jin had just told him and what it meant for the woman asleep at the other end of the corridor. Guowei's men didn't yet have a name, but they were asking. And in this business, once someone started asking the right questions, they always got the answers. The file on Shen Guowei was 43 pages, and Taehyun read all of it before the coffee was done brewing. He sat at his desk in the gray 6 a.m. light, with the file open and a pen in his hand that he hadn't used yet, and worked through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, without hurry, letting the picture build itself rather than forcing it into a shape he'd already decided on. The intelligence was good. Park's people were thorough. By the time he reached the last page, he had a pen mark beside 4 items and a specific cold clarity about what the next 72 hours were going to require. Guowei wasn't expanding into Koreatown opportunistically. He was doing it because someone had told him that the Eastern Corridor's northern anchor was weakening. Someone had given him a map of Taehyun's operational rhythm, which routes moved which product on which nights, which lieutenants held which decisions, which blocks were covered, and which had gaps wide enough to walk a crew through. That information did not exist in any external document. It lived inside the organization. Taehyun closed the file, sat with that for a moment. Outside, the garden was a pale smear of frost and dead grass, the trees skeletal against a sky the color of old concrete. Somewhere in the house, he could hear Mrs. Cho moving. The particular sound of a household beginning its day, kettles and cabinet doors, and the low murmur of the kitchen radio, she kept tuned to a station that played old Korean ballads at a volume just above silence. He picked up his phone and called Park. "Who had access to the Northern route schedule?" he said, without preamble. Park was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of a man who had been expecting the question and had been deciding how to answer it. 6 people, he said. "Same as always, yourself, me, Jin, Ryu, Choi, and the logistics coordinator, Kim Dong-soo." "That's been the same 6 for how long?" 18 months, since we restructured after the Bronx situation. "Pull Kim Dong-soo's communication records for the past 30 days, Taehyun said. "Personal devices too. Everything." Another pause. "That's going to create friction. Dong-soo has seniority. If he finds out he's being reviewed, then he finds out," Taehyun said. "Pull the records." He ended the call, set the phone down, looked at the wall where a painting hung that his wife had bought at a small gallery in Insadong the year before they'd moved to the States, a landscape of mountains rendered in inkwash style, spare and cold and precise. He looked at it when he needed to think without any particular direction, the way some people looked at water. The problem with the leak inside an organization like his was not just the tactical damage. It was the weight of it. The specific gravity of knowing that someone you had trusted with the mechanics of your operation, someone who had sat in your meetings and eaten at your table and handled information that could end lives, had turned that trust into a transaction. He had lived through it before. It never got lighter. Zuri was in the garden at 7 with Han Jun, which was not something Taehyun had arranged or suggested. He saw them from the study window when he stood to refill his coffee. His son sitting on the bench with a notebook open on his knee, Zuri sitting beside him, and between them what appeared to be a geometry problem that Han Jun was explaining with the particular intensity of a child who had recently discovered that he was good at something and was still getting used to the feeling. Zuri was listening, not the polite performance of listening, actually tracking it, her head tilted, asking a question that made Han Jun pick up the pencil and draw something in the notebook, then another question that made him erase it and try again. Taehyun watched for longer than he meant to. He had raised his son to be careful with people. Not cruel, not closed, careful. Han Jun had learned early, too early, that people entered and left and that the leaving was frequently not their choice or his, and he had built around himself the particular architecture of a child who had decided to make himself self-sufficient enough that the leaving wouldn't ruin him. He had his father's reserve and his mother's stubbornness, and a combination of the two that produced, in a 9-year-old, a formidable and slightly heartbreaking quality of self-containment. He was explaining a geometry problem to a woman he'd met 18 hours ago, like it was the most natural thing he'd done in months. Taehyun set down his coffee and went back to the file. The friction Park had predicted arrived at 10:15 in the form of Ryu Seong-min, who knocked on the study door with the specific knock of someone who was furious and had decided to express it as punctuality. Ryu was 41, had been with the organization since before the restructure, and operated the Northern Corridor with an efficiency that Taehyun had depended on and that Ryu knew Taehyun depended on, which was the kind of knowledge that created over time a specific kind of confidence that occasionally drifted toward presumption. He sat down without being invited to sit. "You're pulling Dong-soo's records," he said. In Korean, but barely. The kind of clipped code switching that happened when a conversation was too urgent for social register. "Yes," Taehyun said. "Dong-soo has been with us for 11 years. I'm aware. If there's a concern about his loyalty, you come to me first. I manage his section. I manage him." Taehyun looked at him. Ryu held the look with the steadiness of a man who had practiced this specific form of confrontation and who believed his ground was solid. The problem with Ryu's ground was that it had always been solid, which meant he had stopped checking whether it still was. "Guowei has the Northern route schedule," Taehyun said. "Specifically, not approximations, the actual schedule with the variance window built in. That exists in 6 heads and nowhere else." Ryu's jaw moved. Not quite a clench, the motion of a man recalibrating what he'd come in here to say. "That doesn't mean Dong-soo." "It doesn't mean Dong-soo specifically," Taehyun agreed. "It means one of 6 people. Pulling his records is due diligence. If he's clean, The records will say so, and the friction will have been worth it. And if it's not him, then we pull the next one. Ryu was quiet for a moment. He looked at the desk rather than at Tae-hyun, and Tae-hyun had learned over 15 years of working with this man that when Ryu looked at the desk, it meant he was running numbers, calculating something, not betrayal. Ryu's loyalty was not the part of him Tae-hyun had ever had cause to question. It was something more complicated than that. "There's another thing," Ryu said. "Say it." "The woman." Tae-hyun said nothing. Let the space sit. "People are talking," Ryu said. "Not loudly, but talking. You brought a stranger in off the street. Nobody knows who she is. Nobody knows what she knows. What she might—" "She's a civilian," Tae-hyun said. "She was in the wrong place. That's what you're telling people. That's what happened." Ryu looked at him now, direct. This was the part of the conversation Ryu had actually come for, and they both knew it. "You've never done this. In 15 years, you don't bring people in. You don't create—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Attachments." "I'm aware of my history," Tae-hyun said. "Better than you are." "Then you know how this looks." "It looks like I helped a civilian in distress," Tae-hyun said. "Which is what it is." Ryu stood. The meeting was ending because Tae-hyun's tone had indicated it was ending, and Ryu understood those indications even when he didn't like them. He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand not quite on the frame and said, without turning fully around, "If Guowei's people find out she's here—" "They won't find out," Tae-hyun said, "because the people in this organization are going to maintain operational silence about what goes on inside this estate, which they are already aware is expected of them." He paused. "Weren't they?" Ryu turned enough to meet his eyes. "Yes," he said, and left. Tae-hyun sat in the quiet the departure left behind. Ryu wasn't wrong, technically. The concern was operationally sound. But there was something in the way Ryu had said attachments, with that particular compression of judgment behind it, that Tae-hyun was still sitting with when his phone buzzed with a message from Park that said, "Dong-soo made 14 calls to an unregistered number in the last 30 days. First call was 37 days ago. 3 days after the route schedule was last updated." Tae-hyun looked at the message for a long time. 11 years. Dong-soo had been with the organization for 11 years. He typed back, "Bring him in, quietly, tonight." Zuri found the tension in the house the way she'd learned to find it in every environment she'd occupied, not through any single visible sign, but through the aggregate of small things. The way Mrs. Cho moved through the kitchen at lunch with her shoulders 2 degrees higher than that morning. The way Jin positioned himself in the entrance hall rather than the side corridor he'd occupied the previous night. The way Han Jun, who had been animated and almost loquacious about geometry in the garden, was now very quiet over his lunch and watching his father's face with the focused anxiety of a child running a continuous background assessment of the household's emotional weather. She didn't ask Tae-hyun directly. Not at lunch. The children were there, and whatever was running beneath the surface of his composure was being managed, with visible effort, away from them. She asked him in the hallway at 2 o'clock, when she caught him moving between the study and the rear exit with Jin at his shoulder and the specific forward momentum of a man with a destination. "What happened?" she said. He stopped, looked at her. The assessment in his eyes was faster than it had been this morning. The tempo of his processing had accelerated, which she read as things having moved in a direction he was managing. "A situation within the organization," he said, "not connected to you." "You sure?" A beat. "Yes." "You're lying," she said, "or you're being partial, which is a form of lying." His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. Recalibration. She got the sense that he was not frequently spoken to this directly by people who were not in his operational structure, and that it created a specific adjustment requirement. "There may be someone in the organization passing information to Guowei," he said. "It predates last night. It is not about you." "But if Guowei gets more information about last night, I'm managing it." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now," he said, and his voice had an edge in it that was not quite sharp but was close to it, the sound of a man who was already carrying significant weight and had reached the threshold of what he would discuss in a hallway. She let him go. She stood in the hallway for a moment after he'd moved through the rear exit, processing the shape of what he'd told her. Then she turned and found Hanjun standing at the top of the staircase, looking down at her. "He does that," Hanjun said. "When it gets complicated, he goes somewhere and deals with it, and then comes back and acts like it wasn't complicated." "Does that bother you?" Zuri asked. Hanjun thought about it with the seriousness he seemed to apply to most questions. "It used to," he said. "Now I just watch his hands. If his hands are still, it's okay. If he's doing this..." Hanjun demonstrated a subtle motion, the pad of the thumb moving against the edge of the index finger, almost invisible. "Then it's not okay yet." Zuri looked at him. "You've been watching him a long time." "Since my mother died," Hanjun said, without drama, without the particular self-consciousness that adults brought to that sentence. For him, it was simply a coordinate, a point in time from which certain behaviors had been counted. Sua was too little to know what to watch for, so I learned. The weight of that, a 6-year-old boy appointing himself the household's early warning system after his mother died, settled on Zuri's chest and stayed there. "You shouldn't have to do that," she said. "Somebody has to," he said, with the perfect uncomplicated logic of a child who had filled a gap because the gap was real. Then he went back down the upstairs corridor, and Zuri stood at the bottom of the stairs and understood with sudden and total clarity why Sua had pressed the worn rabbit into her hands that morning. Because Sua had seen something in a stranger's face in a doorway at 6 in the morning and had offered the thing she loved most without hesitation, the way children sometimes did before they'd learned to count the cost. Dongsu arrived at the estate at 8 p.m., having been told there was an operational matter that required his presence. He was 52, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had made him good at his job. Unremarkable in any gathering, impossible to clock as anything other than a middle-aged man going about middle-aged business. He'd coordinated logistics for the organization through 2 territory wars, a federal task force investigation that had gotten uncomfortably close 3 years ago, and the internal restructure that had followed the Bronx situation. He sat down across from Tae-hyun in the room that the estate used for these conversations. Not the study, which was personal, but the meeting room off the main corridor, deliberately featureless, a table and 4 chairs and a window that had been covered. Ryu was not present. Tae-hyun had not invited him. Jin was in the corner. Dongsu looked at the room, looked at Jin, looked at Tae-hyun, and understood the architecture of the evening. To his credit, he didn't perform surprise. "How long?" Tae-hyun said. Dongsu put his hands flat on the table. 37 days. "Who approached you?" "Intermediary. I never met Guo directly, never wanted to." "What did you give them?" A pause. Not hesitation over whether to answer. The math on that had clearly been done before Dongsu walked into the room. Hesitation over how to say it. "The route schedule, the northern variance window. 3 courier personnel names." He stopped. "That's all." 3 names, Tae-hyun said. "They haven't been moved against," Dongsu said quickly. "I've been monitoring." "You have been monitoring," Tae-hyun said, and the flatness in his voice was more absolute than anger would have been. "The situation that you created while continuing to operate inside my organization." Dongsu's jaw worked. "I needed..." He stopped himself, started again. "My son has a debt, a significant one, the kind that doesn't forgive and doesn't wait. And you didn't come to me." The silence that followed was its own answer. They both knew what it meant. Dongsu hadn't come to Tae-hyun because coming to Tae-hyun meant exposure, accountability, the loss of the particular insulation that 11 years of loyalty had built. Coming to Guo was easier. It had a cleaner transaction structure. "You've been inside this organization for 11 years, Tae-hyun said. "You know what this table means. You knew when you sat down." "Yes," Dongsu said, quietly, without trying to change its meaning. Tae-hyun looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the 11 years. He thought about the specific intelligence that Dongsu had handed to a competitor. Not abstract information, but names, schedules, people whose safety depended on those details remaining sealed. He thought about the debt the man's son had accumulated and the terrible human logic of a father choosing his child's survival over his own principles. He understood that logic. He lived adjacent to it every day. That didn't change what the table meant. Your son's debt, Taehyun said. The amount. Dong-soo told him. It was significant, not insurmountable. It will be settled, Taehyun said, from a fund that has nothing to do with your section. Your son will not know where it came from. Dong-soo stared at him. You are finished with the organization, Taehyun continued. Tonight. Your access is closed as of this conversation. You will not contact anyone in the operation. You will relocate. Park will arrange the details. You will have enough to live on. He paused. This is not generosity. This is the version of this that your 11 years bought you. Do you understand the distinction? Yes, Dong-soo said. His voice had changed, lost whatever it had been holding itself around. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a choice that could not be unmade, and who was receiving a mercy that he had not expected and did not know how to carry. The 3 couriers, Taehyun said. I need every detail of what Guowei's intermediary asked about them. They spent another 40 minutes on the specifics. When Dong-soo left, with Jin following him to the gate, not aggressively, just ensuring the exit was clean, Taehyun sat alone in the meeting room and looked at the covered window and thought about the distance between what an organization required and what a human being could sustain. The couriers would need to be moved tonight. New documentation, new routes, new contact protocols. That was Park's next 6 hours. The intelligence Guowei already had would need to be evaluated for what it enabled and what operations were now compromised. Ryu was going to have to be told, and Ryu was going to have to absorb the fact that a man in his section had been running a parallel transaction for over a month without Ryu catching it, which was going to go down in a specific way that would require careful management. And Guowei, who now had enough to begin mapping the Northern Corridor's vulnerabilities, was going to act on that information within a window that was probably shorter than comfortable. Taehyun picked up his phone, made the calls, set things moving. He went back to the main house at 10:30. The children were long asleep. Mrs. Cho had left a covered plate on the kitchen counter that he didn't eat. He stood in the kitchen in the quiet and felt the weight of the evening arrange itself in his chest alongside everything else he carried, the accumulated mass of what running something like this actually cost. The specific toll of it that never showed up in any accounting. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Soft. Careful. Someone who was trying not to wake the house. Zuri appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was in the borrowed clothes again, hair pulled back, and she looked at him with the particular directness she seemed to default to regardless of hour. You're doing the hand thing, she said. He looked down. His thumb was moving against the edge of his index finger. He hadn't noticed. He stopped. Hanjun told you, he said. He told me what to watch for, she said. There's a difference. She moved to the kitchen counter, filled a glass of water, held it toward him. He took it. Did you handle it? Part of it. The rest? The rest is in motion. He drank the water. Guowei has information about my operation that he shouldn't have. The source of that information has been removed, but the information itself is already in play. Which means he'll use it. Yes, probably soon. He's been building towards something for 6 months. What I gave him tonight, what the situation tonight gave him, the incident in Koreatown, his crews asking about who intervened, he's going to have a name within 24 hours. When he has the name, he's going to move. Zuri set her water glass down carefully. Against you. Against anyone connected to me, he said. That's how Guowei operates. He doesn't go for the target directly. He goes for the edges of the target and collapses inward. She looked at him steadily. The children. They have a security protocol, he said. It's established. It's been in place since my wife died. He paused. But the protocol was designed around a household of a specific composition. And now the composition has changed, she said. You don't have a protocol, he said. You're not in the system. My people don't have a framework for your position here because your position here is... He stopped. Undefined, she said. Yes. She looked at the window above the sink. Outside, the grounds were dark, the security lighting doing its quiet work along the perimeter. She looked at the dark for a moment with the expression of someone running calculations that she hadn't expected to be running when she woke up this morning. Then define it, she said. He looked at her. Tell your people I'm under your protection, she said. Formally. Whatever that means in your structure, do it. Because if Guowei is going to know your name by tomorrow night anyway, the part where I'm an undefined variable in your household is a problem for both of us. She met his eyes. I'm not asking to be inside your organization. I'm asking you to close the gap. It was, he thought, a remarkably precise reading of the situation from someone who had been inside his world for 36 hours. If I do that, he said carefully, your position here becomes explicit. You become a known association. Guowei's people, when they map my connections, will find me anyway, she said. You know that. The only question is whether they find me defined or undefined. One of those is more dangerous. The kitchen was very quiet. The radio was off. Outside, somewhere along the north perimeter, a sensor light swept a slow arc across the garden. He looked at her for a long moment, at the steadiness in her face, at the particular quality of courage she was displaying, which was not the dramatic kind, not adrenaline-fueled or righteous, but the grinding, deliberate kind that came from someone who had been surviving hard situations through pure application of will, long enough that they'd stopped finding the calculation novel. All right, he said. He reached for his phone, sent a single message to Park and Jin that was 4 words in Korean. She is protected formally. He set the phone down. It's done, he said. She nodded, picked up her water glass, started toward the hallway, and then stopped at the doorway and turned back. And her face in the kitchen light had something in it that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite fear, and was probably the specific expression of a person who has just crossed a line they knew was there and had crossed it deliberately and was now standing on the other side of it, taking stock. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. In about 20 hours, you're going to understand what that message actually means. She held his gaze. I think I already do, she said, and she went upstairs. Taehyun stood alone in the kitchen. His phone buzzed. Park, confirming receipt. Then Jin, same. Then, from a number that was in his contacts under a name that was not a name, but a code, a message that made the back of his neck go cold. Guowei moved his crew north tonight. Not a probe. Full deployment. He already has the name. He's not waiting. Taehyun read the message twice, set the phone down on the counter with the specific deliberateness of a man who was choosing not to react until he had something useful to do with the reaction. 20 hours, he'd told her. He'd been wrong. They had until morning. He called Park at 11:47 and said 4 words. Move the children now. Park didn't ask questions. That was what 11 years of working together produced, the specific trust that lived in the gap between instruction and execution, the place where most organizations broke down, and his had learned not to. Taehyun heard Park's voice shift into operational register before the call ended, the particular compression of a man switching from standby to active in real time. Taehyun was already moving when he hung up, out of the kitchen, up the stairs, down the corridor to Sua's room first, because Sua was younger and slower, and the sequencing mattered. He opened her door without knocking. She was asleep on her side with the worn rabbit tucked under her chin and her mouth slightly open, and she looked, in the low light from the hallway, so completely and vulnerably small that something moved through his chest that he didn't have words for in any language. He picked her up. She stirred but didn't wake fully, made a sound against his shoulder, the half-conscious protest of a child being moved from warmth. He held her and went across the hall to Hanjun's room. Hanjun was awake. He was sitting up in bed with his reading lamp on and a book face down on the blanket, and his eyes already at the door when Taehyun came through it, as if he'd been listening for exactly this. Get dressed, Taehyun said quietly. Warm layers. Fast. Hanjun looked at his sleeping sister in Taehyun's arms. He didn't ask what was happening. He got up and went to his closet with the controlled efficiency of a 9-year-old who had been mentally rehearsing this scenario for longer than any 9-year-old should have to. The secondary location, Hanjun said, pulling a sweater over his head. Yes. Mrs. Cho? She goes with you. Hanjun pulled on his shoes and tied them and stood up and held his arms out for his sister. Taehyun transferred Sua to him. She was heavy with sleep, her head dropping immediately to Hanjun's shoulder, the rabbit still clutched in her fist, and Hanjun held her with the practiced steadiness of a child who had been holding his sister through difficult things for 3 years. Is it Guo? Hanjun asked. Taehyun looked at his son, at the face that was too calm, too knowing, too prepared for a conversation that no child should be prepared for. Yes, he said, because Hanjun deserved the truth and had always deserved the truth, and Taehyun had spent 3 years giving it to him in measured doses, and tonight there was no time for measuring. Hanjun nodded. Okay, he said. Just that, the word his father used. They went downstairs. Mrs. Cho was already in the entrance hall with 2 bags packed. She'd heard Taehyun's footsteps on the stairs and had moved without being told, which was the kind of efficiency that made her indispensable and occasionally frightening. She took Sua from Hanjun. A car was at the rear entrance, engine running, 2 of Park's men flanking it, not the regular estate staff. These were the specific people Park kept on reserve for situations exactly like this. Taehyun crouched in front of Hanjun at the rear door. His son looked back at him with those careful, assessing eyes. You know the protocols, Taehyun said. Yes. You listen to Park's people, not to anyone who contacts you that isn't on the verified list. I know, Appa. Good. He put a hand on Hanjun's shoulder, held it there for a moment. I'll be there when this is done. Hanjun looked at him with the particular expression that children produced when they were deciding whether to believe something they very much wanted to be true. Then he nodded and turned and got into the car, and Mrs. Cho got in after him with Sua still unconscious against her chest, and the car moved down the rear drive and through the service gate and was gone. Taehyun stood at the rear door for 3 seconds, then he went back inside. He found Zuri in the upstairs corridor fully dressed, the borrowed coat already on. She'd heard the movement. Of course she had. They're out? She asked. Yes. What do you need me to do? He looked at her. The question was practical, not dramatic. She wasn't asking for reassurance or context, she was asking for a task, and the specificity of it was exactly what the next few hours required. Stay close to Jin, he said. Do exactly what he says when he says it. Don't argue the reasoning in the moment. Understood. She paused. How long before they get here? I don't know. The message said they moved north tonight, so that puts them in range within hours, maybe less. He was already moving toward the study. The estate has protocols. We're running them. Taehyun. He stopped, turned. You should know, she said, and there was something in her voice that was careful in a way she hadn't been careful before, calibrated, the voice of someone delivering information they knew would land hard. That when I was downstairs earlier, I heard Jin on his radio, before you got the message. He was talking to someone, not in Korean, in Mandarin. The hallway went very quiet. Taehyun looked at her. What did he say? I only caught pieces. My Mandarin isn't strong, but I caught a number, an address format, I think. And I caught the word for tonight. She held his gaze. I might be wrong, I might have misheard, but I thought you needed to know. He stood absolutely still. The information arranged itself inside his chest with the cold precision of something slotting into a place that had been waiting for it. Jin, who had been with him for 7 years, who was in the corner of the room when Dong-soo confessed, who had seen Taehyun's face when the message about Guowei's deployment came in, who had escorted Dong-soo to the gate and stood there watching the car leave, who had known before anyone else that the children were being moved. And to where? Where's Jin now? Taehyun said, and his voice was the flattest it had been all night. I don't know, Zuri said. I haven't seen him in the last 20 minutes. Taehyun pulled out his phone, pulled up Jin's number, sent a test message, a code word, one of the operational signals that required immediate acknowledgement, watched the screen, the message delivered, read immediately. No response. He called Park. Jin, he said when Park picked up. Where is he right now? A pause. He heard Park moving, heard a door. His post was the main entrance. Let me... A longer pause. He's not at his post. Pull his access logs for the last 40 minutes, Taehyun said, and lock down the secondary location. Change the contact protocol, new verification code right now. Nobody reaches Mrs. Cho or the children through any channel Jin had access to. Done, Park said immediately, and Taehyun heard the operational shift in his voice. The sound of a man who had just understood the shape of the evening and was moving to meet it. What do you need on your end? Every man you can put on the perimeter in the next 15 minutes. We'll have gaps. I know. Fill what you can. He ended the call, stood in the hallway with the phone in his hand, and worked through the implications of Jin the way he'd worked through the Dongsu file that morning, methodically, without the luxury of emotional processing, building the picture. Jin had been in position to hear every significant conversation of the last 36 hours. Jin had heard the message about Guowei's deployment before Tae-hyun did. He would have been monitoring the same channel. Jin had known the children were going to the secondary location before the cars pulled out. If he'd relayed that information, and the Mandarin conversation Zuri had overheard strongly suggested he had, then the secondary location was compromised. Tae-hyun called Park back immediately. The secondary location, he said. Don't just change the protocol. Move them. Different site. Use the contingency. The contingency hasn't been used since... Use it, Tae-hyun said. Now. He heard Park relay the instruction before the call ended. He looked at Zuri. She was watching him with the stillness of someone who had accurately assessed the severity of what she'd just caused to be revealed and was waiting to find out whether it had been in time. You did right, he said, telling me. Is it enough? He didn't answer that. He went to the study and opened the bottom drawer of the desk and removed two things, a sat phone that operated on a different network than his regular device, and a firearm that he checked with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the check was muscle memory. He loaded it, set it on the desk. He stood at the desk and thought about 7 years. 7 years of Jin at his shoulder, in his meetings, in his car, in his house, in the room when his children had been sick and when his wife had been buried, and when the decisions that shaped the organization had been made at 3 a.m. over a desk exactly like this one. 7 years of proximity, of access, of the specific trust that operational closeness produced because there was no other way to run it. He thought about Dong-soo, who had done it for his son's debt. He thought about what Jin had done it for, and understood that he didn't know, might never know, and that not knowing was a particular kind of damage that went somewhere deeper than the tactical implications. The first shot came through the study window at 1:14 a.m. B. It took out the top left pane of the window and buried itself in the bookshelf on the opposite wall, and Tae-hyun was already moving before the glass finished falling, lateral, away from the window, down behind the desk with the firearm in his hand and his body running the protocols that years of surviving exactly this kind of night had embedded below the level of conscious thought. He heard the estate's alarm system engage, heard the security lights cut on across the grounds, flooding the approach, heard voices on the radio, Park's men on the perimeter, coordinating, the clipped call and response of people who had trained for this and were now performing it in real conditions. He heard from somewhere in the house Zuri's voice, not screaming, talking, fast, low, the urgent murmur of someone issuing information. He couldn't hear the words. He moved. Low, fast, out of the study and into the corridor. The main entrance took 2 more shots. He heard them impact the reinforced door, which was built to absorb exactly that, which bought them time, but not unlimited time. The estate's perimeter was approximately 300 meters of defensible ground. He had 6 men on it right now, plus whatever Park could redirect in the next 15 minutes. Guowei had deployed a full crew. How many people constituted a full crew in Guowei's operational language was something he was about to find out empirically. He found Zuri in the kitchen corridor, flat against the wall beside the rear entrance, with Jin's emergency radio in her hand. She'd found it on the kitchen counter, he realized, where Jin had left it when he walked off post. She was listening to it with the focused attention of someone pulling signal from noise. 3 entry points, she said when he reached her. They're working the north fence and the east gate simultaneously. The radio traffic suggests a 3rd team is holding on the south road. They're not moving yet. He looked at her. You understand that radio traffic? My Mandarin is better in context, she said. Not apologetic, factual. What do? We hold the house until Park can consolidate the perimeter. He scanned the corridor. The rear entrance has a secondary lock. The code is 7741. If I tell you to move, you go through the rear, turn left along the service path, follow it to the structure at the end, which is the groundskeeper's building. There is a room inside with a reinforced door. You go in, you lock it, you wait. And you? I deal with what's in front of me. She held his eyes. It's not a discussion, he said, not harshly, with the flat certainty of someone who had stopped having discussions about certain categories of decision. If I tell you to move, you move. Understand? A beat. Yes, she said. The north fence breach came at 1:22. He heard it on the radio. A burst of Korean from one of Park's men, the word for down, and then static. One of his people had taken a hit. He didn't know which one yet. He moved toward the main entrance with Zuri behind him and took a position at the reinforced side window that gave him a sight line across the north approach. The security lights showed him 3 shapes moving across the grounds in the tactical pattern of people who had done this before. Not amateurs, not desperate hired help. Trained personnel moving in coordinated sequence. He counted 3 visible, which meant at least as many he couldn't see. He shot out the light on the northeast corner. The shape of the approach changed. They'd lost their angle, had to redirect. Bought him 90 seconds. He got back to the corridor. Park's voice on the sat phone calling in. North team is pinned. I have 2 men moving to reinforce, but they're 3 minutes out. Eastgate, Taehyun said. Holding, barely. The south team on the road. Have they moved? Negative, still holding position. Why? That was the question that turned over in his mind as he moved back through the house, checking sight lines, maintaining the picture. Guowei had sent a full deployment, north, east, south coverage. The north and east teams were actively breaching. The south team was holding. Why was the south team holding? He stopped in the center of the entrance hall, thought about it with the particular focused stillness that his body sometimes produced in the middle of chaos, the eye of it, the place where pattern recognition worked fastest. The south team was holding because they were not the assault. They were the catch. They were positioned to intercept something coming out of the estate, not to push into it. Guowei wasn't trying to take the estate. He was flushing it, which meant Guowei expected Taehyun to run, which meant Guowei knew exactly where Taehyun would run to. The secondary location. The contingency that Park had just activated. His chest went cold. He called Park on the sat phone, and Park answered on the second ring, and Taehyun said, The contingency site, has the move completed? They're en route, Park said, 15 minutes out. Pull them back, Taehyun said. The contingency is burned. A silence. How? Jin had access to the contingency protocol. If he was running for Guowei, the contingency is burned. Pull them back to a site Jin never had access to. I need you to think of a location right now, Park. A location Jin never knew. He heard Park breathing, heard him thinking. My sister's place, Park said. In Flushing. Jin was never there. Send them there. Direct. No radio communication on any channel Jin had access to. Drive it manually. Understood. A pause. Taehyun. Jin just turned up on the East Road camera. He's with Guowei's South team. There it was. The complete picture, assembled at last. Jin had walked off post, walked through the South corridor, and out to the road where Guowei's people were waiting for him. He wasn't just an informant. He had come to watch. Taehyun put the sat phone in his jacket and turned around. Zuri was in the corridor doorway. She had heard enough. He could see it in her face. The specific expression of someone absorbing a truth that had arrived faster and harder than any preparation could have adequately addressed. Your children, she said. Park is moving them to a safe site. One Jin didn't know. He looked at her. Because of what you told me tonight. She took that in. He watched her process it. The calculation of what would have happened if she hadn't told him, if the Mandarin overheard in a hallway had seemed too uncertain to report. He saw the moment she arrived at the answer and looked away from it. A shot hit the east-facing wall, close. The plaster cracked in a line above the window. He moved toward her and she didn't flinch back. He stopped 2 feet from her and said, There's something I need you to understand right now. Tell me. What I said before, about going to the groundskeeper's building if I told you to move. That instruction is still active, but I need you to know that if the East Gate falls and Park's reinforcement doesn't hold, I'm going to do something that will change the nature of what this is. She looked at him steadily. What does that mean? It means I'm going to stop managing this defensively, he said. It means I'm going to go to the East Gate myself. And when I do that, the probability profile of the next hour changes significantly. For you. Yes. And you're telling me this because you deserve to know what you're inside, he said. You asked me that in the garden. I told you the truth then. I'm telling you the truth now. The radio burst. Park's voice, clipped and urgent. East gate is down. They're through. Taehyun looked at Zuri. She held his gaze without looking away, and there was something in her eyes that was not fear exactly, though fear was present. It was something alongside the fear, something that had decided, in the specific way that decisions got made in moments like this, that it was not going to move. Go, she said. I've got the rear. He looked at her for 1 second, one full second, which was longer than the situation technically allowed, and which both of them understood was not about tactics. Then he turned and went to the east gate, and the night opened up into something that neither of them had come to this city expecting to survive. The east corridor was dark. The security lights on the east approach had been taken out systematically, professionally, the way trained people cleared an approach. And he moved through it by memory and by the sound of boots on gravel outside and the specific signatures of a breach in progress. He reached the east door, reinforced steel, holding but stressed, the frame showing the first signs of yielding around the lower hinge, and took position to the left of it and waited. The door came in fast. 2 men through it moving in tandem, the practiced entry of people who expected resistance and were prepared for it. The first took Tae-hyun's elbow across his throat before he'd fully cleared the frame. The second got 3 steps inside before the situation resolved itself in a way that left him on the floor. A third man came through more carefully, having processed the 2-second silence that had replaced the expected sound of his colleagues making progress. He came through low and fast and got Tae-hyun's shoulder as Tae-hyun moved. The impact was hard enough to drive him into the corridor wall, and for a moment his vision compressed at the edges and the firearm went somewhere he couldn't immediately locate, and the man hit him again in the ribs, the specific targeted force of someone who had been told to take this one alive, or as close to it as conditions allowed. Alive. Guo wanted him alive. He processed that information while his body processed the pain and found the calculus clarifying in an ugly way. Alive meant Guo wanted something from him, something operational, information, concession, capitulation, something that required Tae-hyun functional and responsive. And the most efficient leverage for extracting that kind of concession from a man was not the man himself. The third man had him against the wall with a forearm across his throat and a gun pressed under his jaw and was saying something in rapid Mandarin. Instructions, Tae-hyun thought, about not fighting, about compliance. And Tae-hyun was almost listening to it when he heard, from the direction of the rear entrance, a sound that stopped everything in his chest. A door. Impact. Zuri's voice, short, sharp, cut off. Then nothing. The man with the forearm on his throat said, in English now, deliberate and clear, "She's already in the car. You want her to stay the way she is? You come with us." Tae-hyun went very still. The man took that stillness as compliance and eased the forearm fractionally, and in the margin of that fraction, Tae-hyun made a decision that bypassed every protocol and every calculation and every strategic framework he had spent 20 years constructing and moved in a way that was not strategic at all, was pure and violent and brutal and without architecture, the kind of movement that had no name in any training manual because it came from somewhere below training, from the place where a man stopped calculating and started burning. The forearm came off his throat. He used the half-second of the man's surprise to drive an elbow into the space below the man's ear, and when the man's knees buckled, he was already moving, through the east corridor, through the rear passage, toward the sound he'd heard. The rear entrance was open. The secondary lock had been forced, not picked, forced, which meant they'd had the time to do it, which meant Zuri had been alone back here for longer than he'd understood. The service path outside was empty. The groundskeeper's building at the end of it was dark. He ran. He ran the length of the service path, and his ribs screamed from where the man had hit him, and his breathing was ragged and wrong at the edges, and he ran anyway, because the sound he'd heard, that short, sharp cutoff, was a sound he was not going to process calmly from a tactical distance. The groundskeeper's building door was open. Inside, a chair overturned. A broken lamp. On the floor near the reinforced room's entrance, The borrowed coat. Just the coat. One sleeve twisted as if it had been pulled from a moving person, lying flat on the concrete like a shed skin. He stood in the doorway and looked at the coat, and his chest did something that had nothing to do with the broken rib he was becoming increasingly certain he had. His sat phone. He pulled it, called Park. "They took her," he said. "From the rear. How many cars went out the South Road in the last 10 minutes? He heard Park moving, heard radio traffic, heard the specific controlled chaos of a perimeter that had been breached and was being reclaimed section by section. "2 vehicles, Park said. "South Road, moving fast. We have a partial plate on the second one." "I need them found," Taehyun said. "I need them found in the next 20 minutes, or I need to know where Gwawe is operating out of tonight, because that is where they are going." "I know where he is," Park said, and something in his voice was different, tighter, the particular tension of someone holding information they'd been waiting for the right moment to deploy. "We've had eyes on a location in Sunset Park for 6 days. Warehouse facility on the waterfront. That's where he's been running the operation out of." "Why didn't I have that 6 days ago?" A pause. Half a second. "Jin controlled the surveillance schedule," Park said. "The report was in the queue. It never got to your desk." Of course it hadn't. "Send me the address," Taehyun said, "and get me 2 cars at the front gate in 5 minutes. "Taehyun, you're injured. Let me send a team." 5 minutes, Taehyun said, and ended the call. He stood in the groundskeeper's building for 30 seconds, looked at the coat on the floor, thought about a woman who had told him about her dead parents at a kitchen table with the particular steadiness of someone who had learned to carry weight without assistance, who had heard Mandarin in a hallway and had reported it without being certain it was relevant because the uncertainty was not sufficient reason not to tell him, who had said, "I've got the rear," and meant it without performance. He picked up the coat, folded it once, set it on the workbench. Then he went to the front gate. The warehouse district in Sunset Park at 2:30 in the morning was the particular landscape of a city's functional unconscious, the part that kept running while the rest of it slept, loading docks and container yards and the smell of the harbor mixing with diesel and cold air off the water. The buildings here were wide and low and utilitarian, and they held their contents without advertisement, which made them useful for exactly the kind of operation Gwawe was running. Park's coordinates put the facility mid-block on a waterfront service road, behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire and flanked by 2 other warehouses that were legitimately occupied and therefore useful as visual cover. The cars stopped 2 blocks north, and Taehyun got out and assessed the approach with the specific attention of a man who had been breaching facilities like this for 20 years, and who was currently operating on adrenaline and a broken rib and a motivation that had nothing tactical in it whatsoever. He had 4 men with him. Park had wanted to send 8. Taehyun had taken 4 because 8 took longer to move and made more noise, and the math on the next hour was not about overwhelming force. It was about getting to a specific room before whoever was in that room made a decision that couldn't be walked back. He briefed the 4 men in 30 seconds. Entry points, sequencing, the objective. The objective was 1 person, alive and intact. Everything else was secondary. They moved. The fence was the first problem, and the bolt cutters made it not a problem. The approach to the warehouse's eastern loading door was 50 meters of open ground between 2 pools of light, and they covered it low and fast in the gap between the light cycles, and the man on the loading door saw them with approximately 2 seconds to react, which was not enough. Inside, the smell of salt water and machine oil, and the particular ambient cold of a large space that wasn't heated for human comfort. Stacked containers, a forklift parked at the far end, overhead lights at half power casting long shadows between the structures. A metal staircase on the north wall leading to an elevated office section, glass-fronted, lit from within, figures visible through the glass moving with the casual confidence of people who believed they were secure. Taehyun counted 4 figures in the office, possibly more behind the line of sight. At the base of the staircase, 2 men, heavy, armed, the particular posture of professional security that was accustomed to its presence being sufficient deterrence. It wasn't going to be sufficient tonight. He sent 2 of his men along the container row to the south side of the staircase base, took the other 2 and moved along the north wall. The math was simple and ugly, and he worked it without ceremony. The men at the staircase base were competent. In a different situation, on a different night, with more preparation on both sides, this would have gone differently. Tonight it went the way it went because Taehyun was moving with the specific velocity of a man who had one thing in his mind and was not distributing his attention across anything else. And that concentration of purpose was its own force multiplier. It was over in 40 seconds, and he was climbing the stairs with his jaw set and his broken rib telling him about every step and the gun in his hand, and his breathing coming in the controlled pattern he'd learned to impose on his body when it wanted to do something faster than useful. The office door was reinforced, but not adequately for the method he applied to it, and it opened, and he went through. 4 men. He'd counted correctly. 2 of Guowei's operational staff at a table covered in maps and laptops, who registered his entry with the delayed shock of people who'd believed the staircase to be impenetrable. A 3rd man, Guowei's head of security, a person Taehyun recognized from intelligence photographs, named Bao, who moved fast, got halfway to a response before one of Taehyun's men cleared the doorway behind him, and the calculation changed, and Shen Guowei himself, sitting at the head of the table in a chair that someone had carried up here specifically for him, which told you something about the man. The insistence on comfort inside operational settings, the refusal to be functionally indistinguishable from his surroundings. He was 60, compact, wearing a suit that was too good for a waterfront warehouse, and wearing it with the complete self-possession of someone who dressed for who they were rather than where they were. He looked at Taehyun coming through the door, and his expression did something that was almost, not quite, but almost, impressed. "You're faster than I expected," Guowei said in Mandarin. "Given the rib." "Where is she?" Taehyun said. In Mandarin, flat and direct as a nail going into wood, Guowei tilted his head slightly. "You came here for her." Not a question, something else. Verification of something he'd hypothesized and was now confirming. "Not for me. Not for the operation. For her." "Where?" Guowei leaned back in his chair. The 2 men at the table hadn't moved. They were watching Bao, reading from him whether this was a moment to act, and Bao was watching Taehyun's man in the doorway and making the correct calculation. "She's in the building," Guowei said. "She's fine. She'll remain fine as long as this conversation stays civil. I'm going to need to see that for myself before any conversation happens." Guowei looked at him for a moment. Then he said something to Bao in rapid Mandarin, a sentence with a direction in it, a room number. Bao moved toward the door, acknowledged Taehyun's man, and the 2 of them went somewhere below while Taehyun stood in the office with his gun and his broken rib and the specific coiled tension of a man waiting for confirmation that the thing he'd come here for was still the way he'd left it. 3 minutes. The longest 3 minutes he'd spent in recent memory, and his recent memory included a lot of difficult minutes. Then he heard footsteps on the stairs. He heard 2 sets, Bao's heavy professional tread, and underneath it, another sound, lighter, the particular rhythm of someone who was moving under their own power, but with a constraint somewhere, something off in the cadence. Zuri came through the door ahead of Bao with her hands free, and her face set in the expression he was beginning to recognize as her default response to situations that were trying to break her. Jaw forward, eyes direct, the absolute refusal to perform distress for an audience. There was a cut above her right eyebrow that had bled down the side of her face and dried, and she hadn't wiped it off, which told him either she couldn't or she'd decided not to bother. She looked at him. The expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't crack, but her exhale was longer than the ones before it. "You came," she said. "Yes," he said. Not elaborating, not performing it, just the fact. She moved to stand beside him, not behind him, and he noted that without comment. Guowei watched this with the evaluating attention of a man who was still running his own calculations. "You see," he said. "Fine. As I said." He looked at Zuri with the dispassionate assessment of someone appraising a variable. "She's interesting, this woman. When my people brought her in, she asked for a phone. Said she needed to make one call. When they said no, she spent the car ride quietly identifying every detail about both vehicles she could see from her position." He paused. "One of my men found her memorizing the license plate of the second car in the side mirror, not panicking, memorizing. Zuri said nothing. She didn't know if you were coming, Guowei continued. She was building contingencies. Can we get to what you want? Taehyun said. You deployed a full crew against my estate, burned one of my most senior people to run the operation, and you want me here in this room for a conversation. So have it. Guowei folded his hands on the table in front of him. The Northern Corridor, he said. The territory above 28th that your organization has held for the better part of a decade. I want it formalized, documented, a transfer that my organization can reference in any subsequent dispute. You want me to sign over territory, Taehyun said. In exchange for what? In exchange for this building not becoming significantly more complicated. Guowei's eyes moved briefly to Zuri and back. And for certain things I know about your operation's current vulnerabilities to remain between us rather than finding their way to federal ears. There it was. The full shape of it, finally. Not just the territory. The leverage. Guowei had enough from Jin's intelligence to make a credible approach to federal investigators. Enough to create the kind of scrutiny that would be slow and corrosive and expensive and ultimately more damaging than a straight territorial conflict. Taehyun looked at him. You'd take that to federal authorities. I would find it deeply unfortunate if I had to, Guowei said, with the particular diplomatic syntax of a man who had been threatening people politely for 40 years. And you brought her here, Taehyun said, to make sure I understood the stakes were personal as well as operational. Guowei's expression shifted fractionally. I brought her here because she was in the building when my people secured it. The personal dimension. He looked at Taehyun with something that might, in a different man, have been called recognition. You provided that yourself. By coming here alone with 4 men instead of waiting for your organization to consolidate and respond through proper channels. He paused. You could have sent Park. You came yourself. That tells me everything I needed to know about the value of this particular variable. Zuri said quietly, without inflection. He's telling you that you made me more valuable as leverage by coming personally. I know, Taehyun said. And? He looked at Guowei. Thought about the Northern Corridor, 10 blocks of territory that represented a significant revenue anchor for the operation that had taken 4 years to consolidate after the last dispute, that multiple people had taken risks to secure and maintain. He thought about federal scrutiny, which was the kind of thing that moved slowly and then arrived all at once with catastrophic weight. He thought about the specific intelligence Jin had provided, which was damaging enough to be genuinely useful to the right investigators. He thought about the asset that Guowei had decided he could use as a pivot point. The woman standing beside him, who had memorized a license plate in a moving car in the dark because she didn't know if anyone was coming, but she was building contingencies anyway. The territory, Taehyun said. You're asking me to formalize a transfer. A partial transfer, the 3 northern blocks. In writing, signed, witnessed. And the federal information remains private, as long as we maintain a functional understanding. A functional understanding, Taehyun repeated, meaning ongoing compliance. Guowei said nothing, which was the answer. Taehyun was quiet for a moment. The office hummed with the specific tension of people who were reading each other at speed. Bow near the door. The 2 men at the table, still watching, still waiting. His own men in position. The gun in his hand that he hadn't raised and hadn't lowered. You've been planning this for 6 months, Taehyun said. You placed Jin 2 years before that, which means this conversation, this specific offer, was always the objective. Not the estate assault, not the Koreatown cruise. This room, this table, this offer. He looked at Guowei directly. You built all of it toward a moment where I'd sign something. Guowei's expression was very slightly pleased. You're as good as people said you were. The problem, Taehyun said, is that you built toward the wrong pressure point. A beat. Something moved in Guowei's eyes. A man who would sign over territory under duress, Taehyun continued, because of a personal connection, is a man whose operation can be managed through personal connections indefinitely. You'd own the Northern Corridor, you'd own the compliance, and you'd own me. He paused. You've been doing this long enough to know that arrangement has a specific shelf life. Eventually, the man either finds a way to resolve the personal connection or he finds a way to resolve you. He also sometimes simply complies, Guowei said, for long enough that it becomes the new structure. Not this man, Taehyun said. The room was very still. Outside, the harbor wind moved against the warehouse walls with a low industrial moan. Zuri shifted slightly beside him. Not retreat, readjustment, the subtle movement of someone resetting their balance. He didn't look at her, but he registered it. Guowei looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Zuri with the assessing gaze of someone who was recalculating the value of a piece on the board. "She's not afraid," he said. More observation than statement. "She's been in this building for 30 minutes. She's not afraid." "No," Taehyun said. "Most people are afraid." "She's not most people." Guowei tilted his head, looked from Zuri back to Taehyun, with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he hadn't fully reached before this moment. "You came here for her," he said again, "but not because you're attached to her, or not only." He paused. "You came here because of what she represents." Taehyun said nothing. "You've been running this organization for 15 years, Guowei said. "Your wife died. Your children grew up inside it. You've been in rooms like this one for 20 years, and you have never once, in any account anyone has given me, acted on something that wasn't tactical." He looked at Zuri. "And then this woman has been in your house for 36 hours, and you drove here with 4 men and a broken rib." He set his palms flat on the table. "What does that mean?" "It means," Taehyun said, "that I would like you to release her and let us both walk out of this building, and in return I will give you something worth substantially more than 3 blocks of Northern Territory." Guowei's expression sharpened. "What?" "Information," Taehyun said, "about the federal task force that's been building a case against your Sunset Park operation for the last 4 months." The air in the room changed. Bao moved very slightly at the door, an involuntary adjustment, the kind a person made when their threat assessment recalculated without permission. "You don't have that information," Guowei said. "Careful, calibrated. I had federal scrutiny of my own 3 years ago," Taehyun said. "I cultivated certain relationships during that period that have remained useful. I know the name of the lead investigator on your case. I know the 2 witnesses they've been building testimony around. I know the timeline." He paused. "That information is worth more to you right now than any territory I could sign over, and you know it." Guowei looked at him. The calculation was visible in his face, not the expression itself, which was controlled, but in the quality of his stillness, the way certain men went very still when the math was running fast. "Proof," Guowei said. "You provide verifiable information. I provide the lead investigator's name and one specific detail about the case structure that only someone with actual access could know. You verify it through your own channels. When it checks out, and it will, we have a conversation about the exchange. And until that conversation concludes?" "She walks out of this building right now," Taehyun said. "That's the precondition. Not negotiable, not part of the exchange. Before I tell you anything, she's out." Guowei was quiet for a moment. Outside, the harbor wind shifted, pushed against the east wall, found a gap in the cladding somewhere that produced a thin high note. "If the information doesn't verify," Guowei said, "then you still have everything Jin gave you," Taehyun said. "You're no worse than you were before this conversation." Another silence. Guowei looked at Zuri with the assessing regard of a chess player evaluating a piece he'd decided to release. Then he looked at Taehyun and said, in the particular tone of a man who was making a decision he was not entirely comfortable with but recognized as correct, "She goes." Bao moved away from the door. Taehyun looked at Zuri. She was already looking at him. Her jaw was set, and her eyes had the specific quality they got when she was running calculation, and he could see the conflict in them. The part of her that understood the situation and the part of her that did not want to leave him in this room. "Go," he said. I know what I'm doing," he said. Low, direct. Not reassurance, statement of fact. "Park has people 2 blocks north. Tell them I said to hold their position until I come out." She held his eyes for one moment. That was several things at once, and none of them had names that were useful in this room right now. Then she turned and walked toward the door, and Bao moved aside, and she went through it. And he heard her footsteps on the metal stairs going down, and he tracked the sound of her all the way to the bottom and across the warehouse floor and to the loading door, and then she was outside, and he exhaled once and turned back to Guowei. who was watching him with an expression that was the closest thing to respect that Tae-hyun had seen on his face all evening. "The investigator's name," Guo said. "Special Agent Dana Mercer," Tae-hyun said. "She's running the case out of the Brooklyn field office, not the Manhattan hub, because she thinks your people have a flag on the Manhattan operation. She's right. She's been running it dark for 7 months." He paused. "The primary witness she's building toward is a former logistics coordinator from your Red Hook subsidiary. His name has been changed. He's in temporary housing in New Jersey. You've been looking for him for 4 months." The blood left Guo's face in a specific and visible way, not dramatically. The man was too controlled for drama. But the color shifted and his jaw set and the eyes went to a quality of flat attention that Tae-hyun recognized as someone receiving information that was structurally catastrophic for something they'd believed was secure. "You have the location," Guo said. "I have the location," Tae-hyun confirmed. Guo looked at the table, looked at his hands. "The Northern Territory," he said. "You're not signing anything." "No," Tae-hyun said. "I'm not." "And the federal information on my operation. In exchange for a border agreement. Documented. The Koreatown crews pull back, the expansion north stops. Your operation stays south of 23rd. My operation stays north of it. We maintain that for 3 years with a renewal option." "You're negotiating," Guo said, with something that might have been disbelief and might have been, again, that reluctant quality of recognition. "I came here to get her out," Tae-hyun said. "She's out. Now I'm handling the part that needed handling anyway." He looked at Guo levelly. "You've been in my territory for 6 months. You are going to have to deal with me eventually. I'd rather do it tonight while I have something you need." The room held its breath. Bao at the door, the 2 men at the table, the harbor wind against the walls. Tae-hyun's men positioned, reading him, waiting. Guo looked at him for a long moment with the comprehensive attention of a man taking full measure of another. Then he said, "Bao, get the documentation." And Tae-hyun breathed. Once, through the broken rib, the pain of it sharp and clarifying and almost welcome, the body's blunt reminder that the night was real and he was still in it, and it was not finished, not yet. He signed the border agreement at 2:57 in the morning with a pen that Bao produced from his jacket pocket, and a document that Guo's people had drafted on a laptop and printed on a portable unit that someone had thought to bring to a waterfront warehouse, which told you something about the degree to which this evening had been planned. The document was 3 pages. Tae-hyun read all 3 before he signed anything, which seemed to mildly irritate Bao and did not seem to surprise Guo at all. When it was done, Guo took his copy and Tae-hyun took his, and they looked at each other across the table in the particular way of 2 people who have just formalized something that neither of them fully trusted, and both of them intended to honor only to the precise degree that the other honored it first. "The witness location," Guo said. Tae-hyun gave him a number, not an address, a contact, someone who would provide the address upon verification of a code word that Tae-hyun also provided. 1 layer of insulation. Enough to demonstrate good faith, not enough to be catastrophic if Guo decided the agreement meant less than the paper it was printed on. Guo received this without visible reaction. "You're careful," he said. "I'm still alive," Tae-hyun said, which was the complete answer. He left the office. He walked down the metal stairs with one hand on the railing because the rib had graduated from a sharp complaint to a deep grinding insistence that was going to require medical attention in the near future, and he crossed the warehouse floor and went out through the loading door into the cold harbor air and stood on the dock approach and breathed. Zuri was 20 feet away. She was standing at the edge of the dock with her arms crossed against the cold and her face turned toward the water, and when she heard the door, she turned. She looked at him, the full-length look that people did when they were checking for damage, running the inventory. "You're limping," she said. "I'm aware. Is it done?" "For tonight." She looked at him for another moment and then looked back at the water. He walked to where she was standing and stood beside her. The harbor was black and restless, lights from the opposite shore laying broken lines across it, a container ship moving somewhere in the middle distance, with the slow inexorability of something that had committed to its direction and was not revisiting the decision. "Park's people are behind us," she said. "I told them what you said. They've been waiting." "Good." "Jin is with Guo's South team," she said. "Park knows." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the water and moved through her hair, and she didn't seem to feel it or had decided not to. "What happens to Jin?" she said. Not quite a question. "He made a choice," Taehyun said. "The choice has consequences. That's how it works." "I know how it works," she said. "I'm asking what happens to him." He looked at her profile, at the cut above her eyebrow, dried and dark in the harbor light. "He'll be found," he said. "And he'll answer for what he did. Not tonight, but it happens." She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it, not flinching from it, not performing acceptance of it, simply taking it into the same place she seemed to take all the difficult things. The place that had been receiving difficult things for long enough that it had developed a specific capacity. "He had 7 years," she said, "in your house, with your children." "Yes." "And he's still—" "Yes," Taehyun said. She turned and looked at him then, direct, the way she always looked at him. "Does it ever stop being surprising? When someone you trusted—" "No," he said. "It doesn't." She nodded, once, slowly, like she was filing that away in the category of things that were true and that she would rather not be true but was not going to pretend otherwise. Park appeared at his shoulder, materialized, really, with the particular noiselessness that made him good at his job. "Cars are ready," he said. "Mrs. Cho is at the Flushing location. Children are secure. Hanjun is awake." "Of course he is," Taehyun said. He asked— Park paused with the slight hesitation of a man relaying a message he finds both touching and logistically inconvenient. He asked whether Zuri was okay. Something moved across Zuri's face. She looked away, back at the water, and her jaw tightened in the specific way it did when something had gotten through the exterior and she was deciding whether to let it show. "Tell him she's fine," Taehyun said. "Yes," Park said, and withdrew. Taehyun looked at Zuri. She was still looking at the water. "We need to go," he said. "I know." She didn't move immediately. Stayed with the water for another moment, the way people sometimes needed to stay with something, not because they didn't know it was time to leave, but because leaving required a preparation that rushing didn't help. Then she turned and walked toward the cars, and he walked beside her, and neither of them said anything, and the harbor wind came off the water behind them like something being left behind. The medical was handled at a private facility that asked no questions about the nature of injuries because it had been established specifically to provide care in situations where questions would be inconvenient. A doctor named Yoon, who had been on retainer with the organization for 8 years, confirmed the broken rib, taped it, noted 2 other contusions that were significant but not structural, administered something for the pain that Taehyun accepted with less resistance than usual, because the rib had moved from grinding to the kind of insistent agony that made clear thinking expensive. Zuri's cut required 4 stitches. She sat on the examination table while Dr. Yoon worked on it with the stillness of someone who had made peace with physical discomfort as a recurring feature of certain kinds of lives. She didn't hold Taehyun's gaze while it was happening. She looked at the wall and breathed evenly. And when it was done, she touched the stitches once with 2 fingers, lightly, testing, and got off the table. "Concussion protocol," Dr. Yoon told her. "Someone wakes you every 2 hours tonight." "I'll be fine," she said. "That's not how concussion protocol works," Dr. Yoon said, with the serene authority of someone who had been overridden on medical advice by difficult people for 20 years and had arrived at a place beyond irritation. Taehyun said, from across the room, "Someone will wake her." Zuri looked at him. He looked back. She didn't argue. They drove to Flushing at 4 in the morning through streets that were not empty but were operating at a fraction of their daylight density. The city in its minimal overnight mode, the infrastructure of it still running without the human layer that made it legible as a place rather than a system. The car moved through it, and Taehyun sat with his taped rib and the medication's careful warmth and looked out the window and thought about the agreement in his jacket pocket and what it was worth and what it would cost to enforce it and what the next 3 years of operating under it would look like. Beside him, Zuri had fallen asleep sitting up. Not collapsed, sitting, spine reasonably straight, head inclined against the window at an angle that would produce a neck ache in the morning. She was breathing through her mouth slightly, the way people did when they'd been running on adrenaline for hours and it had finally metabolized. The stitches above her eyebrow were precise and neat against the dark of her skin, and she looked in the car window light profoundly and simply exhausted. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the window. Han-jun was awake, as Park had said. He was sitting in the kitchen of Park's sister's apartment in Flushing. A narrow, bright place that smelled of garlic and laundry detergent. When they arrived, with a glass of water in front of him that he appeared to have been using as a focal point rather than actually drinking. He was still in the school clothes he'd pulled on in the dark 2 hours ago. Mrs. Cho was in the adjacent room with Sua, whose ability to sleep through geopolitical disruption to the household remained, apparently, unimpaired. Han-jun looked up when Tae-hyun came through the door. His eyes went to the rib, to the way Tae-hyun was holding himself, the slight adjustment of posture that pain produced even when you were managing it, and then to Zuri behind him, and the cut above her eye, and then back to his father. "You're hurt," he said. "It's been handled," Tae-hyun said. "Rib, it'll be fine." Han-jun looked at Zuri again. "She's hurt too." "4 stitches," Zuri said from behind Tae-hyun. "I've had worse." Han-jun appeared to consider whether to pursue this medically or let it go. He let it go. "Is it over?" he said, looking at his father. Tae-hyun pulled out the chair across from his son and sat down with the careful deliberateness of a man managing a broken rib and the accumulated weight of a very long night. He looked at Han-jun, at the dark circles under his eyes and the set of his jaw and the particular alertness of a child who had been holding a vigil without being asked to because nobody had told him he could stop. "The immediate part is over," he said. "The rest takes time." Han-jun processed this with the thoroughness he applied to everything. "Guo-wei, we have an agreement. Is it real?" "Real enough for now," Tae-hyun said. "Real enough that he has more to lose by breaking it than by keeping it. That's as real as these things get." Han-jun looked at the water glass. "Jin," he said, quieter this time. "Yes." A silence. Han-jun had known Jin since he was 4 years old. Jin had been one of the fixtures of his life the way certain adults became fixtures, not parental, not instructional exactly, but present, reliably present in the background of things. Tae-hyun watched his son arrive at the knowledge in real time and absorb it with the same self-controlled deliberateness he absorbed everything, the armor of a child who had learned early that feelings needed to be processed on a delay. Was he always? Han-jun started and stopped. "I don't know," Tae-hyun said honestly. "I don't think so. I think something changed. People change. Not always like that." "No," Tae-hyun said. "Not always like that." He leaned forward, carefully, rib permitting. "How are you?" Han-jun looked at him. The question in this household, at this hour, in these circumstances, carried more weight than its 4 words suggested, and both of them knew it. "I'm okay," Han-jun said, which was the answer he gave when he meant, "I'm not okay, but I don't know yet what I am, so I'm using this as a placeholder." Tae-hyun had been receiving that answer for 3 years and had learned not to challenge it in the moment. There was a time for it, and this wasn't the time. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." Han-jun stood, picked up the water glass, started toward the hallway, and then stopped, and without turning around said, "I'm glad she's here." Tae-hyun looked at him. "Go to sleep, Han-jun." His son went. Tae-hyun sat in the kitchen alone with the fluorescent light and the smell of garlic and the agreement in his jacket pocket and the rib and the weight of everything the night had been. He sat with it the way you sat with certain things, not solving them, not processing them toward a conclusion, just being in the same space with them and letting them be as large as they were. Zuri appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had the borrowed coat off and the concussion tiredness in her eyes, and she looked at him sitting in the kitchen in the 4 a.m. quiet and said, "You should be sleeping. So should you." "Someone has to wake me every 2 hours," she said. "Doctor's orders." "Mrs. Cho will do it." Mrs. Cho is 63 and has been awake since midnight managing 2 children in a crisis relocation. She pulled out the chair Han-jun had vacated and sat down. "I'll stay up for a while." He looked at her. The stitches. The exhaustion. The particular quality of her stillness, which was not peace exactly, but was something that lived adjacent to it. The stillness of a person who had been through something and had come out the other side and was now in the strange aftermath space where the body was still running, the emergency protocols, and the mind was starting to understand they weren't necessary anymore. What Guo said, she said, in the warehouse, that you came because of what I represent. He was performing analysis, Taehyun said. Was he wrong? Taehyun looked at the table. No, he said. He wasn't entirely wrong. She was quiet for a moment. What do I represent? He considered how to say it. He was not, by nature or by training, a man who said things like this, who located the language for the interior of a thing and delivered it directly. He dealt in the exterior, the operational, the factual. The interior was a place he had learned to manage by not spending too much time in it. But it was 4 a.m, and he was medicated and his rib hurt, and the woman across the table had stitches above her eyebrow and had memorized a license plate in a moving car in the dark on the off chance that it might be useful to someone who might or might not be coming, and the least he could do was try to say the true thing. The possibility, he said, that things don't have to remain the shape they've been. She looked at him across the kitchen table. Her hands were flat on the surface, one on each side of where Hanjun's water glass had been, and she was looking at him with the full directness that was her default setting and that he had come to understand was not aggression, but simply the absence of the protective indirectness that most people maintained as standard courtesy. You've been running this thing for 15 years, she said, and you've been alone inside it for 3. Yes, that's a long time to be alone inside something that big. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at her hands. I've been alone for longer, she said. It's a different kind of alone because the thing I was inside wasn't a power structure. It was just my life, which sounds smaller but isn't necessarily. No, he said. It isn't. She looked up at him. I don't know what I'm doing here, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't have a plan. I don't have a story about what this is or where it goes. 3 days ago, I was sleeping on a friend's couch, and now I have stitches from a man I'd never heard of before Tuesday, and I watched you negotiate a territorial agreement with a crime lord at gunpoint, and I don't... She stopped, exhaled. I don't have a framework for this. Neither do I, he said. She looked at him. That's not reassuring. I know. He looked at her steadily. But it's true, and I think you prefer true to reassuring. A moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more reluctant and more real than a smile. The specific expression of someone who has been accurately seen and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Yeah, she said. I do. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the apartment, Soo-ah made a small sleep sound, audible through the wall, the half-conscious noise of a child shifting in a strange bed, and then silence again. I'm going to restructure the organization, Taehyun said. She looked at him. Not tonight, he said. Not this month. But it's been something I've been building toward for 2 years, and tonight... He paused, the right word not immediately available. Tonight made certain things more clear than they'd been. He looked at the table. The legitimate businesses are real. The security and logistics operation generates revenue that exceeds what the other side produces. The other side has become what it became because of momentum. Because stopping something that large requires a specific kind of resolve that I had been postponing. But what changed tonight? She asked. Not leading him, genuinely asking. He looked at her for a moment. Guo said I came to that warehouse because you represent the possibility that things can be different, he said. He meant it as an analysis of a weakness, but he wasn't wrong about the possibility. He looked at his hands. I don't want my son to inherit this, the way it is. I don't want Soo-ah to grow up counting security lights and memorizing emergency protocols. He paused. I've known that for 2 years. Tonight I stopped having the option of postponing it. Zuri was quiet. She was looking at him with an expression that was careful and real, and that had something warm moving under the surface of it, the specific warmth of a person who has been alone for a long time recognizing something in another person who has been alone in a different way. That's going to be hard, she said. Restructuring something like that. Yes. You'll have resistance from inside. Yes. Ryu, she said. He looked at her. She had absorbed more about the organization's internal dynamics in 3 days than most people managed in months. Among others, he said, "But you'll do it anyway." "Yes," he said, "I'll do it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to do something when things stabilize. I want to establish something, a resource center. Women who've been in situations like the one I was in before Tuesday, housing instability, trafficking exposure, domestic situations. I did that work for 8 years and I know how to do it." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to fund it with anything that comes from—" "I have legitimate holdings," he said. "The foundation structure is already in place for charitable work. It's been used for community investment in the Korean business district." He paused. "This would fit." She absorbed that. Something in her face moved. The particular expression of someone who has been trying to build something in conditions that kept undermining the foundation, and who has just been shown that the ground might, for the first time, actually hold. "I'm not a project," she said, quiet, clear. "I'm not something you're fixing." "I know that," he said. "I want to be sure you know that. You memorized a license plate in the dark in a moving car because you weren't sure help was coming," he said. "I know exactly what you are." She held his gaze. The kitchen light was steady and a little harsh, and the stitches above her eyebrow were dark, and the exhaustion was in every line of her face, and she looked, in that moment, like exactly what she was. A person who had survived a very long time through the application of will and intelligence and the refusal to stop building contingencies, and who was sitting in a kitchen at 4 a.m. across from a man who had broken a rib, driving alone to a waterfront warehouse, because the alternative was something he was not willing to allow. "Okay," she said, "just that." The same word she'd said in the garden. The weeks that followed were not simple. Restructuring something the size and nature of Taehyun's operation was not a decision that resolved itself cleanly on the strength of the decision being made. It was a process, and the process had friction in it, the kind of institutional friction that came from people who had organized their lives around a specific structure, being told the structure was going to change. Ryu pushed back, hard, in the first meeting, and then harder in the second. And by the third meeting, he had shifted from resistance to the specific negotiation of someone who had accepted the direction and was working on the terms. Taehyun gave him terms that were fair. Not generous, fair. Ryu understood the distinction and accepted it. 3 other senior people left. One of them left cleanly, with a settlement that reflected his years and his conduct. The other 2 left in ways that required management of a different kind, and Park handled it, and it was done. The federal matter, the Guowe case, the task force that Special Agent Dana Mercer was building in the Brooklyn field office, resolved itself 8 months later in an indictment that named 11 people in Guowe's operation and did not name anyone in Taehyun's. The border agreement held through the first review period. Guowe, facing a prosecution that was going to occupy the next decade of his life, had more pressing concerns than territorial ambition in Koreatown. Jin was found in February. He was found by Park's people in a safe house in Jersey City, where he had been living since the night he walked off the estate. And what happened in that building was something that Park reported to Taehyun in 4 words, "It's been handled, sir," and that Taehyun received and did not pursue the details of, because some things were operational and some things were personal, and Jin had been both, and the handling of both was now complete. He told Hanjun in the spring, simply and directly. His son listened and was quiet for a long time, and then said, "I know you had to." Taehyun said, "Yes." Hanjun said, "I don't like that we live in a world where you have to." Taehyun said, "Neither do I. That's why things are changing." His son looked at him with those careful, assessing eyes and nodded and went back to his geometry. The foundation was established in March. Zuri spent 6 weeks on the structure, legal, financial, operational, with a focused intensity that cleared every room she was working in of any ambient distraction, the intensity of a person who had been waiting years to rebuild something they were good at and had been given, finally, ground that held. She named it after nobody. She described its mission in language that was plain and direct and that said exactly what it did without ornamentation. The first intake happened on a Tuesday in April. 3 women. One of them was 22 years old and had been sleeping in a car in Queens for 6 weeks and had a 4-year-old daughter with her. Zuri processed their intake herself, in the building that the foundation had leased in Flatbush. 2 floors of a converted brownstone, not large, not lavish, functional and warm, and equipped for what it needed to do. She came home that evening to the estate, which had been repaired and resecured in the months following October, and which was, in the way that houses became things over time, beginning to be different from what it had been. Not in any single visible way. In the accumulation of small things, Sua's drawings on the refrigerator, Hanjun's geometry notebooks on the kitchen table, the specific quality of noise in the hallways in the evening that had changed from the quiet of careful management to the noise of actual living. Taehyun was in the garden when she arrived. He was not on his phone. He was standing near the rose bed, which had come back in April. The new growth red-tipped and insistent, and he was simply standing there in the early evening light doing what she had learned he sometimes needed to do. Existing in a space without an agenda for it. He heard her come through the gate and turned. "How was it?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Good." She came to stand beside him. The roses smelled like cold and green, the early spring smell, not yet sweet. "There's a woman, 22, daughter is 4. Same age Sua was when her mother died." He looked at her. "She slept in a car for 6 weeks, Zuri said, with a 4-year-old in February." She looked at the roses. "We got them into housing today, temporary but real housing, a bed, a kitchen." She stopped. The daughter asked if the bed was hers, just hers, if she had to share it. She stopped again. He waited. "It's hers," Zuri said, "just hers." Her voice was steady, completely steady. "She's 4 years old, and that's the thing she needed to know." They stood in the garden in the early evening light and didn't speak for a moment, and Taehyun looked at the roses and at the woman beside him and thought about the distance between a rainy alley in Koreatown in November and this garden in April, and all the things that had to happen and be survived and be paid for and be grieved and be built for the distance to be that much. It was not a small distance. "Sua asked me something today," he said. Zuri looked at him. "She asked why you came to live with us." He paused. "I told her you needed a place." "What did she say?" "She said that was lucky, because we needed someone too." He looked at the rose bed. "She's 6. She was matter-of-fact about it." Zuri was quiet for a moment. He heard her exhale, the long exhale, the one she did when something had gotten through the exterior and she was deciding whether to hold it there or let it be what it was. "I don't have anyone," she said, quietly. Not the way she'd said it in the alley, not the flat reportage of someone stating a fact that couldn't be changed, something different. The echo of it, held up against where she was standing right now. "You said that to me in an alley 6 months ago," he said. "I know. And I told you then. You said, 'Then I am your family now,'" she said. "You said it like you were stating a fact, like it was already decided." "It was," he said, "for me, at that moment." He looked at her. "I'm not always fast at the interior things, but I'm fast at knowing what's true when I see it." She looked at him. The evening light was doing the specific thing it did in spring, the long golden quality of it, and it was on her face and on the stitched scar above her eyebrow that had healed clean and neat, and that she had stopped touching the way she'd touched it in the first weeks. She looked at him with the full directness that was her nature, and that he had come to understand was one of the most valuable things about her, the refusal to look at anything sideways. "I was wrong," she said. He looked at her. "In the alley, when I said I had no family," she held his gaze. Her voice was steady. "I wasn't wrong about the past. I was wrong about what was coming." She paused. "I hadn't found you yet, or you hadn't found me. I don't know which way it goes." "Both," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the roses, and something settled in her face. Not the tight management of a person holding things in, but the genuine settling of a person who has arrived somewhere and recognized it as the place. The particular expression of someone who has been surviving for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to be somewhere that was simply, plainly theirs. From inside the house came the sound of Sua at full volume, some crisis of the domestic variety, the specific pitch that indicated either Hanjun had been unfair about something or dinner was not proceeding on schedule. Hanjun's lower voice underneath it, the weary elder sibling register that he was still too young to use without it being slightly heartbreaking. Mrs. Cho's answer to both of them, patient and final. Zuri's mouth moved, not the reluctant, almost smile she'd given him in the kitchen in Flushing. A real one. The whole thing, unmanaged, and it changed her face entirely, opened something in it that the months of careful survival had kept shuttered, and he looked at it and thought about Guo saying, "She's not afraid," like it was a remarkable property, and thought that fear was the wrong frame entirely. She wasn't fearless. She was something harder than fearless. She was someone who had been afraid many times and had kept moving anyway, who had built contingencies in moving cars, and stood beside men in warehouse offices and started resource centers with 3 women and a 4-year-old in a converted brownstone, who had walked into a stranger's car in the rain because the alternative was running out of alternatives. "We should go in," he said. "We should go in," she agreed. She turned toward the house. He walked beside her across the garden, through the late spring evening, toward the noise and the light of a household that was currently generating a low-level domestic dispute over dinner, and that was, in all the ways that actually mattered, full. At the door she stopped and looked back once, at the garden, the roses, the last of the evening light going out over the wall, with the expression of someone confirming a coordinate, noting where they were, so they could find their way back to it. Then she went inside, and the door closed behind them both, and the garden was quiet, and the roses stood in the last of the light.